Have you ever played a modern game and wondered how graphics became so advanced? And which games were responsible for pushing the technology forward? In this video, I'll give a brief overview of where these visual features were first introduced or popularized. So let's begin, shall we? In plain speech, dynamic shadows are calculated in real time and based on the shape of the object and the location of the light source. The technology had to wait until the late 90s since early hardware found the task too computational. Before that, shadows were either missing or projection-based. Quite possibly the first example was Crusaders of Might and Magic. Its geometry is very simple, as you can see, but the shadows behave just like they would in modern games. Severance, Blade of Darkness, was a highly rated role-playing game that melted PC hardware of the time. It essentially allowed all objects to cast shadows, which until then had been unheard of. Silent Hill 2 was the first to use stencil shadows. These are also real-time, but the process is different. They work with shadow volumes that represent areas where light is blocked by objects. And then, special buffers calculate where shadows can be drawn on screen. It's very accurate but computationally expensive when compared to normal dynamic shadows. Of course, I cannot mention stencil shadows without including Doom 3. Its levels were built entirely to elevate the contrast of light and darkness. It was the reason so many gamers loved its atmosphere. But while it never went away completely, most developers found it too demanding and too restricted. It was much harder to render soft shadows, and alpha transparencies proved problematic as well. When it comes to dynamic lighting, most people will point at Pandora Tomorrow as the first to utilize this feature. But in reality, the game to fully embrace dynamic lighting was a weird title called Stretch Panic. Simply speaking, dynamic lighting allows lights and shadows to change in real time as light sources move within the environment. You can see how character shadows are bouncing off walls here when there are explosions of light in the scene. Before dynamic lighting became a thing, though, we had to rely on light maps. Their intentions were the same, but they functioned in a far more primitive fashion. In this case, lighting effects were created by pre-calculating lighting information and storing it as texture maps. We often forget that skyboxes used to be flat texture images. One of the first games with animated skyboxes was Quake. It was still relatively simple, but highly effective in setting the overall atmosphere. But it was with Halo Combat Evolved that we finally got skyboxes as they are today, giving the impression of depth and complexity that has become standard for game development. But skyboxes improved even further, sometimes helping to expand on exposition and sometimes creating awesome set pieces. For me, Crysis was probably the first game where the clouds looked realistic. The first game that comes to mind when discussing volumetric lighting is probably Red Dead Redemption 2. The way light shimmers between tree branches and cascades through windows is just phenomenal. It adds a sort of depth to the graphics that until recently would have brought most GPUs to their knees. But just in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of optimization that made it less taxing on hardware, especially on older hardware. Volumetric lighting has actually been around for decades now, although it was far more simplistic on games like Unreal, for example. Still, you could see how the light was scattering from some surfaces. It kept being improved upon until Crysis showed us glimmers of its potential in open environments. But in my opinion, Far Cry 2 still does volumetric lighting better than most games today. Global Illumination is the logical next step and works much the same as volumetric lighting, except that light doesn't just come from primary light sources, but also light that bounces off other surfaces. It's remarkable that The Last of Us was the first to use this technology, given the age of the PS3. It's a testament of developer ingenuity that such beautiful graphics could be squeezed from such an old console. Crysis was the first game to utilize ambient occlusion. Doing so gave it bragging rights, but back in 2007 the technology was still in its infancy and somewhat rough around the edges. Essentially, it uses shaders to realistically add shadows into areas where light is supposed to be occluded. So graphics will naturally look more convincing. It looked alright as long as you didn't pay close attention to details. The technology was still unrefined in Escape from Butcher Bay from 2009. You can see here how Riddick's face looks smudged when the game is running with ambient occlusion on. But things would get better in 2011 when Crysis 2 was released with lots of technical improvements. One of these was horizon-based ambient occlusion, which had improved heavily on the first game's implementation. Rise of the Tomb Raider would improve matters further with voxel ambient occlusion. And finally, Battlefield 5 would have its say with ray-traced ambient occlusion. Crysis 2 wasn't the first game to incorporate tessellation into its graphics engine. I'm not sure, but I think that privilege belongs to Stalker, Call of Pripyat. And by the time of its release, the technique was already becoming mainstream. But I would say tessellation was definitely perfected with Crysis 2. Tessellation is a fairly complex technique, but essentially it gives computer models depth by subdividing their vertices into smaller triangles. It also adds finer details to the texture maps, thereby creating bumps and ridges. So it does enhance the graphics, albeit with some compromise to performance, so it's a fairly costly technique. I'm going to give the official definition here since I don't know if there's a better way to explain. Chromatic aberration is a visual effect that simulates the way light refracts through a camera lens, causing a slight color separation or fringing around the edges of objects. Dying Light wasn't the first game where this visual technique was widely used. It had already been implemented in Max Payne 3, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and Destiny. But the effect was much stronger here, and some gamers weren't impressed. Personally, I don't actually mind it. Alien Isolation makes the best use of chromatic aberration. The effect isn't overly strong, so most people chose to keep it enabled. But why even bother with it? Computer-generated graphics tend to look artificial, so chromatic aberration helps to add realism. It's still used in many games today, but obviously it has been toned down quite a bit. Reflections have always been important in video games, whether it be mirrors, water surfaces, or metallic objects. Most of us only start noticing reflections when they're absent, like here with Half-Life, for example. But after dynamic shadows and lighting, reflections arguably have the biggest impact on graphics. In older games, mirror reflections typically consisted of lower resolution duplicates of environments, as well as duplicate player character models. Once three-dimensional gaming was in full swing, planar reflections became the norm. Developers incorporate an extra rendering pass for the entire environment, which involves crafting a room and introducing a virtual camera to function as a reflective mirror. Cube maps are another method to add reflective surfaces, as shown here with Half-Life 2. It's not as popular for some reason, but it can look quite good when corrected with parallax. Screen space reflections use a rendering technique that adds local reflections to objects in a scene. They only reflect objects that the playable character can see, so anything behind the character or to the side will not get reflections. Understandably, this has a benefit to performance and frees up resources for other graphical enhancements. However, there's a real problem with screen space reflections, as demonstrated here in Control. Reflections tend to disappear when viewed from certain angles. Conversely, ray-traced reflections don't have that problem, staying consistent regardless of angle. Battlefield 5 was the first game with ray-traced reflections, but Cyberpunk has shown the world what the technology is capable of. It was pioneered by NVIDIA and meant to accurately calculate how light bounces off surfaces. In many ways, it incorporates the same techniques as Global Illumination, but obviously it's even more advanced. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the video. If you found it useful, please consider giving a like. It really helps with the algorithm. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.